Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you here tonight. Welcome to Wednesday Night Bible Study. I'm Richard Lee, and folks online, it's good to have you with us as well. I hope everybody grabbed a little prayer sheet here in the room. They're up here on the two kind of side tables. Does anybody need one in the back? Okay. Just want to mention we do have those for you. And for our folks online, we have that as well. I want to start with a couple just announcements, things that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. First off, this Sunday, of course, is Mother's Day. We're always so thankful for our moms. We also have family commissioning service happening that morning, and there's no evening service this Sunday night. So if you got a mom that you can get close to that night, go see your mom, all right? But no evening services that night. This Tuesday is Max Angels. That'll be up here. That's for our senior adults. Starts off about 10:30 over here at the coffee pot, and then we have a guest speaker and a luncheon afterwards. So that is this Tuesday. So ask me any questions if you'd like to be a part of that, but just a good reminder. We also have on Sunday, May 19th, so not this Sunday, but the next at 4 p.m., we have a special called members meeting. We're going to be talking about the special gift that was given to the church and kind of the direction we're headed with that. So I encourage you to be there for that day. And also on the 19th, at morning service, is our graduate recognition service. So, we got a lot of high school students and college students that are graduating. We want to just call attention to that in a special time that Sunday morning. And then Thursday, May 23rd, is our Upward Awards Banquet. So those that have been helping with our soccer teams out in the fields the last many, many weeks of soccer practices and games, it all comes to a conclusion May 23rd. So good things there. And then, of course, June 3rd through the 7th, which you have this in the box on your list, Vacation Bible School is almost here. Encourage you to help with that if you can, or sign up children, grandchildren. Children's camp's right around the corner after that. Of course, youth camp as well, and music camp. So we're about to hit a crazy wild time here at the church, but all good things. Now, let's go ahead and turn our attention to the prayer list. I just got a couple of prayer requests in from Loretta Morgan just a moment ago. These are not on your sheet. Miss Loretta said she's just having a crazy time, and her poor family is right now too. Her sister, Brenda, is in ICU at one hospital, and her wife's, her sister's husband is at a different hospital in ICU also. So we want to remember Brenda and her husband Jim Morris are their names. So Brenda and Jim Morris, but they're both in different hospitals at this moment. Also, Miss Loretta shared, her other sister, Gail, had fallen and had injured her shoulder really bad and is really going through some tough pain right now. And the fourth one was her aunt, Miss Joyce, is dealing with serious kidney failure right now at Ochsner's. So Miss Loretta's got a lot on her plate. We want to remember all these things going on and with that family. And then let's look over the list together. Not a lot of new ones today, but definitely want to continue to lift up everyone. Lisa Crane was supposed to have had surgery, and that was postponed indefinitely, so we're hoping that she gets assigned a place very quickly so she can have the surgery she needs. Continue to pray for Dr. Forrester. I've been told he's been doing a little bit better, but I know he's still having really hard days, so I want to pray for him and his wife, Cheryl. And Landon Vickery, about halfway down. Landon, I'd asked last week for you guys to be praying for him. I want you to continue to pray for him. He is doing better. They have kind of figured out specifically what's going on with him, but now we just need to pray for him to start feeling better. But he's one of our junior high boys, and so it's always tough when a young man's being held down like that. And then on the back page, I want to mention Gary Wester. Of course, his surgery is on the 17th of this month, so be in prayer for him. He's one of our Ecuador mission team leaders. And then over on out of town list, Tommy Malone, that's Judy Brinkerhoff's brother. He's having a lot of medical issues right now. We want to keep him in our prayers. Are there any others we can add to the list tonight? Once again, I'm so glad you're here, and Jason Thomas is going to be coming up to lead us after we finish. But let's pray right now. Our sweet Heavenly Father, God, we just walk in your presence right now, Lord, and we are so thankful just just to be with you. Lord, I'm thankful for these sweet people in this room and folks online, Lord, that are just pausing right now to come into your presence with me as we lift up these prayer requests. God, we ask you to be in each and every one of these situations, Lord. The many names on this list there's so many lives going through so many different things. Lord, we ask you at this moment, Lord, just for guidance and healing and comfort for Loretta Morgan's family, with their sister and her brother-in-law both in ICU, Lord. Be with the doctors and the teams working with them now, Lord, and God, just carry them through this very tough time. The same for her sister Gail and for her Aunt Joyce, Lord. God, may healing, if that is your will, Lord, happen, Lord, whether just through a miracle, Lord, or through the doctors and the nurses. But God, please have your will done. But Lord, we ask for your mercy in this situation, God, I ask you just to open doors for Lisa Crane, God, that this surgery would be set up and that she'd be able to go ahead and get this handled. And Lord, the same for Landon, Lord, that he'll start to feel better, God. We know that they've defined what's going on. But Lord, it's going to take him a while to really feel comfort, and we ask for you, God, just to walk with him and carry him through that very difficult time. Lord, for our special team members that are getting ready for Ecuador, God, we ask you just to start to prepare their hearts, Lord. And that same area, God, we ask you to be with Gary, Lord, who's been a long-time member and leader for our church in helping us in Ecuador. And God, we ask you just to be with him in the surgery that's coming up. And the same for Tommy Malone, who's out of town, Lord, just to be with him through these tough medical issues that are going on. God, we ask you just to pull us close. Lord, be with the sweet families, Lord, throughout our church, with all the sweet children and grandchildren, Lord, roaming the halls. Lord, may we hear your word tonight. May we see you, and may we turn to you in every situation. Lord, good or bad, that we're turning to you and focusing on you. God, we love you, we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right. Well, here we go. Welcome one and all. So, a project that was actually part of my seminary class that I'm about to finish up right now, that Bart had assigned me, was finding teachers to teach all 5 of the big discourses in the book of Matthew. And Brother Rodney started us off with that many, many moons ago. And as you've seen, periodically a few guest teachers pop up here and there. Hopefully they started their sessions with telling you. So we're about to jump into this next big block of teaching or discourse in the Gospel of Matthew, and more or less provides something of a summary and introduction. I actually, in an unplanned way, had the chance to jump in for the 3rd discourse. I had to cover for Brother Jeff Richard. Him and his family were sick that week. Either way, this is the last of those discourses, as we are on our 5th and final one together. So, I will say something of a preamble, though. This one's going to be a little bit more difficult. And part of the reason is because this one has a lot more eschatological, that's a big word there, implications to what's being said here than the other discourses have. So just to define that word eschatology, for the most part, it means doctrine of last things, but it's almost come to embrace exclusively to the exclusion of all the others, or things that fell under that umbrella. Basically, the doctrine of what happens at the end when Christ returns. So, depending upon what your particular view might be of this chapter, may very well help determine for you what exactly your thoughts on this chapter will be. There's way too much for us to cover in a meager 1.5 hour session, and there's a lot that's already transpired in the Gospel of Matthew. Somewhat, we're going to rehash that tonight for us to even understand so that we can appropriately appreciate what's being said here in this particular chapter. Oftentimes, it has a tendency to be excised from this portion of Matthew and interpreted more or less in a vacuum with other passages that deal mostly with eschatology and or apocalyptic type of things, and lumped together as more of a systematic doctrine or theology. But the problem with that is without it being properly anchored in the text in which it's pulled from, it's easy to start reading things into it that may not be there. So of all the ways that we could try to approach this tonight, I don't want to just simply tell you this is how you should think of it. Rather, I want to treat us all as if we're horses and lead you to the water and let you choose to drink, to follow the breadcrumb trail along with me, and even challenge me along the way if you think I'm deviating away from the path that we should be following on. And I hope to answer questions along the way. My normal practice is I will just suck all the air out of the room and talk all the way down to the very last second, but I realize in a teaching setting that's not always conducive to learning. So I hope to get done with at least a few minutes left available for questions. So please build them in your mind as we're going, but if you want to stop, raise a hand. This is recorded and it's being live streamed. I promise I won't call you out by name, but I will try to repeat your questions so anybody listening in can hear it, and we'll try to all learn together. All right, so Matthew chapter 24, this actually spans the contents of Matthew chapters 23 all the way through the end of 25. And we won't be gathering together as life groups this Sunday because it's Mother's Day. So as we've had to work through those breaks in our life group progression, you may choose to, if you're a life group leader or whatnot, discuss the contents of this with your group come next Sunday. But it actually serves as a great primer for the conversation that's being had not only tonight, but for those nights as well, and your reading of Matthew 24. All right. So here we go. Let's try to understand something of the trajectory of Matthew's gospel thus far. So here we are at the very tail end of this last and final discourse. There's a reason why Matthew has given us 5 succinct blocks of Jesus' teaching. Dr. Quarles has made it very clear to us, as has many other commentators, scholars, theologians, why this is. Matthew seems to be wanting to implement a very clear understanding that Jesus is a new but greater Moses. Matthew is telling this story in such a way that from its outset we understand that he wants us to appreciate Jesus in the shadow of Moses, to then come right out from that shadow and into the limelight as the promised and anticipated messianic deliverer that these ancient prophets, spanning both before the exile to Babylon and after the exile to Babylon, has said would eventually come. All right? Now, we're going to follow this breadcrumb trail together. I know it might be a little small on the screen, so you have additional screens around the room, and I'll try to zoom in here or there if need be to help you better understand what's being said here. But I want to start off with the first chapter and just walk through this so that we can all eventually arrive to Matthew 24 together, hopefully thinking the same things that Matthew wants us to be thinking before we get there. All right, so at the start of the gospel, the new Moses, and you'll notice I have it in quotations if you can see it. The new Moses is born. After that, the new Pharaoh in the story pursues Moses, Messiah. Now, at several of these little red dots along this map, I'm going to be referencing Jesus as Moses Messiah, Isaiah Messiah, David Messiah. Part of the reason for that is Matthew, in his geniusness, is not just simply painting Jesus as a new Moses or telling the story of Jesus as that of Israel in Egypt in exile, coming out of Egypt through Moses' efforts to deliver them and God's power working through him to then bring them out through the wilderness to Sinai, from Sinai to Canaan, and then fulfilling the Abrahamic promise of changing the world. Matthew expands this story to encompass basically all of the Old Testament. He's essentially telling the entirety of Israel's story that begins in the garden with Adam all the way up through their exile to Babylon and their restoration. So at many different points in this story, we're going to see Jesus standing there talking and acting as though he's Moses, but then at other moments he's going to be saying things and or doing things, and the atmosphere that Matthew is setting up for us in the story is actually going to be a lot more akin to David or to Solomon or maybe even to Jonah and a myriad of other prophets. And in a chronological sense, he seems to preserve the entirety of Israel's story, starting with the Garden of Eden, as I said, marching toward their exile to Babylon. And he sets up these stories, or some may call them pericopes, so that we can appreciate Jesus moving through these storied moments in Israel's past. And at some moments, He's redeeming the brokenness of Israel's story, and at other moments, he's standing in for a prophet and pronouncing the same doom because of the same march to destruction that Israel has stubbornly set themselves on by virtue of the fact they are rejecting God's will, they are rejecting God's messenger and Messiah, and they want nothing to do with that plan. So, the new Pharaoh pursues the Moses Messiah. I only ask you, based on what your knowledge is of Matthew's birth narrative, if Jesus is painted as the new Moses, then who's the Pharaoh in the story that's pursuing after him to try to kill him? Herod the Great, precisely. Continuing on in chapter 2, as Jesus is born and staying in Bethlehem, maybe for a couple of years, now into his early toddlerhood, we have foreigners coming to honor Messiah. But now this is a very huge, pivotal point, and I cannot state the importance of this enough. Although its subtlety is easily lost on us as westernized Gentile readers separated 2,000 years culturally and spatially from this story. But if we've really dug our heels into the Old Testament, this should not be surprising to us to hear it. Number one, we should be anticipating it. So way at the bottom of the screen, I'm showing you that the pivot away from the old Jerusalem begins here. Now, here's the reason why. I want to take you to Isaiah chapter 60, and I want you to read this with me. So in Isaiah 60, we're just going to read through the first 6 verses. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord shines over you. Whether you're using your iPhone Bible or your print Bible, if it's a study Bible, there's probably a superscript, letter number, something there that points your eyes to the bottom of the page, and is telling you that the pronoun there, you, at the end of verse 1 is... Anybody got it? I hear somebody whispering, Jerusalem. That's right. Jerusalem is the referent here of verse 1. So look, darkness will overcome the earth, total darkness, the peoples, but the glory of the Lord will shine over you. His glory will appear over you. So try to get that mental picture if you can. Imagine the landscape completely bathed in darkness, the entire world consumed in it except for one drop of light coming down from heaven above over Zion. Nations magnetically will come to your light, and kings to your shining brightness. So raise your eyes, look around. They will all gather and come to you. Your sons will come from far away, your daughters on the hips of nursing mothers. Then you will see and be radiant, and your heart will tremble and rejoice, because the riches of the sea will become yours, and the wealth of nations will come to you. And here we are. Caravans of camels will come to your land, young camels of Midian and Ephah. All of them will come from Sheba, and these are all oriental regions to the south by southeast of Israel. They will carry gold and frankincense and proclaim the praises of the Lord. So these magi, these foreigners, they happen to come from what direction? They live where? In the east, and they're traveling toward the west. And they happen to be carrying with them some very expensive parcels, and they offer these gifts up to Jesus. And of those gifts, we all know them, they happen to be myrrh and gold and frankincense, exactly. So when we get to this particular moment in the story itself, we happen to see something that Matthew is just hoping that we'll catch in the backdrop here. So these foreigners arrive at Jerusalem where they expect the Davidic descendant to be born, and they realize as now the city is in an uproar as they're announcing their arrival, and the reason that they're here is to see this newborn promised messianic king born probably to the house and line of David. And yet the one who's seated on the throne is not a descendant of David. And of course, this causes all of Jerusalem, along with Herod and his house, to be extremely troubled. And of course, the star that has led them there does not leave them in Jerusalem, but it led them there. Now, why did it lead them to Jerusalem if God knows that Jesus has been born in Bethlehem? Why not just take them directly there? There's a reason why we have this pit stop there. It's because Jerusalem, that should be the city of the king, is the place that's most hostile toward the king, and will continue to be for the trajectory of this narrative all the way up to the very end. For nearly 30 years later, this king will be standing in the vicinity of the walls of this place, who just a week before heralded him as Messiah and are now condemning him, judging him, crowning him, not with gold and jewels, but with thorns. Not putting diadems and robes in his hands, but instead nails. And exclaiming that their king is Caesar, not this heralded son of David. So, what are we seeing Matthew do here? As the wise men leave Jerusalem to then go to Bethlehem at the guidance and behest of the star in the heavens above, what we're watching here is now God is pivoting focus away from old Zion on the map to the new Zion. Because notice this, when you read the rest of the context of Isaiah 60, it continues to speak about this place as a walled city, and yet people are going to come and bow down at the feet of, cities don't have feet, but people do, and these magi come to bow at the feet of a small toddler child and lay these expensive gifts, as Isaiah called them, gold and frankincense at his feet. So what is Matthew essentially telling us? Zion up on the hill is not the place where the story climaxes as the Zion of Isaiah's scroll. Rather, it's a walking, talking child. He's the city. He's where the light from heaven shines around, and the glory of the Lord will shine around him to the nations, and they will be magnetically drawn to the Messiah city of Jesus. Anybody confused on that? Awesome. Let's go. So now, Moses, Messiah, flees Egypt, but he's not in the land where pyramids are built. Instead, he's in the Egypt that Herod Pharaoh rules over and literally flees to Egypt of old to find refuge there. So what is Matthew telling us about Jerusalem? And folks, we can't underscore the importance of this enough. It's such a deeply embedded theme in the context of the New Testament that when John concludes the entirety of the canon of Scripture for us in the apocalypse we call Revelation, he speaks of the city Jerusalem being both Sodom and Egypt, the city where their Lord was crucified. Imagine that. Egypt and Sodom are the epitomes of places that God truly decimated with divine fire from heaven and 10 plagues destroying the land before he wipes out a generation of firstborn. It can't get any worse than that as far as the scriptural narrative and types and shadows go. And Jerusalem has become that very place, rife with demons and evil of all kinds. And it only gets worse when you read the annals of history preserved to us by Josephus from the time of Jesus' disappearance and ascension to heaven until its destruction at the hands of the Romans. So John announces a new Exodus conquest. Consider where John is. He's at the Jordan River. Why does the Jordan have such extreme significance in the story? This is where Israel leaves the wilderness and enters their inheritance. It's the very line of demarcation where manna was given, then stops and they eat the produce of the land. He goes there not because water is a scarcity. There's all kinds of pools in Jerusalem to baptize in. There's a couple of different seas to go. But Jordan is the place where Israel, as an old generation, died in the wilderness. A new one crosses through now to claim the land and are victorious in that conquest. So essentially, John is speaking about the Exodus that Isaiah promised has arrived. How do we know that? Well, anytime anybody asked John, are you the Messiah? Are you any of these other prophets? He would always say no. And instead, he would give the answer of, I am the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness. Make way, right? That's Isaiah 40, verse 3. But Isaiah 41 and 2 are, comfort my people Israel. Tell her time of hard service is over. Captivity in Babylon is done. Exile is at its end. Exodus has come. So John is saying, hey, that exile from sin is done. The exile and spiritual oppression is done. Come here for renewal. And now, as you go back to the land you came from, starting here at the Jordan, recognize a conquest is coming at the other end of this Exodus. Just like the Exodus in the Old Testament story starts in Egypt, but it really doesn't end until the conquest in Canaan has reached its completion. So then we have the parting of the waters for the new Messiah. There's a reason why Jesus is baptized also in the Jordan. It's the whole Exodus theme, the conquest thing happening. But it's also the Noah story, all of it together, swirling in the background. The important thing we need to realize, granted, waters don't really part for Jesus to walk through on dry land, but God speaking from heaven above and the Spirit descending through the firmament above, which is the waters separated above, is literally tearing the waters that are above apart to speak, to impart the Spirit upon Jesus, and this is the launching of the new Exodus. I hope we get that. I know I might be going at a twinge of a fast pace, but there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, if we camped out on all these dots, I would never get to chapter 24, and we need to get there to talk about those contents. Secondly, this is recorded, so anybody that cares to could always go back and rewatch a few of these moments. And thirdly, hopefully in the fall, this will actually introduce to us a series of conversations about the millennium and all the different perspectives that are housed with regards to that 1,000-year period referenced in Revelation. And this conversation is going to be key for that. So I have to lay a lot of foundation work for when that time comes. And breathe easy, I'm not the one giving all of those talks. I get one, but others will have those as well. And then, Messiah Israel is tested in the wilderness in chapter 4, right? 40 days, 40 nights, just like Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years, Moses on the mountain for 40 days, 40 nights. And the serpent slithers his way right through Jesus' feet to try to tempt him, test, but Jesus emerges victorious in this to demonstrate the fact the kingdom through this exile exodus movement has finally arrived. Then, as chapter 4 continues, Matthew is weaving the story in a way that's slightly different from his compatriots, Mark, Luke, and John. He immediately starts the process of showing us the first disciples that are called. Now, Jesus is going to summon the 12 from the larger group of the disciples later on, but it starts now with the fishermen being called. Why does Matthew put this moment strategically in the story where he does? To show us that just as Messiah Israel is coming out of the wilderness to start this new conquest, but first he has to leave his Egypt behind, which was in chapter 2. We have 12 tribes that left Egypt of old under Moses. Jesus is calling out not 10, not 15, not 100, but 12, who he is going to forge as his core base that will be a renewed Israel for this conquest period. Now, it's interesting, though, and this falls in line with what Matthew sets up for us in Matthew chapter 2, in showing us that the light of God's glory is pivoting away from the Jerusalem of old and the stone walls of mortar and whatnot, to then show us that it's the small child who's now grown into a man. Why doesn't Jesus house his base of operation in Judea? They're not hostile to him yet there. And the king who sought his life when he was but a toddler has long since died, and now a couple of his descendants after him are reigning on the throne. And he's an obscure Nazarene carpenter for anyone else who cares to know. No one is thinking anything spectacular would happen to this man or with this man here. So why not set up his base of operations there? Matthew tells us it's to fulfill some prophecy, and Isaiah, sure, but at the same time to further cement the idea that Jerusalem is not where the center point of the focus of the story is, but rather it's in the north. And Jesus, throughout the entirety of this story, you can hear it in the language, the words, phrases, the scowls on people's faces that they use when Jesus is anywhere in Judea or Jerusalem, and the way they talk down about him and to him because he's an outsider. He's a Galilean. Even their accents betray it, right? Essentially, they're the ignorant, uneducated, backwater hicks. And nobody is assuming anything good would ever come from Nazareth. Just like in Isaiah chapter 40, when God is predicting and telling that a conquering king is going to be the one who will blitzkrieg the nations, consume the world in dominion, and he will hand them all over to him. But it isn't the son of David. It's Cyrus, a pagan Persian emperor, who will set the framework up for when the true Messiah eventually comes. It's all to get them off of their expectations and out of their biases to appreciate what God is doing. Moving on, Moses, Messiah, gives his Torah. So as soon as we're done with chapter 4, we go right into chapter 5 and 7, or through 7. And with that, this is exactly what Isaiah said would happen. That this servant who is the bringer of the Spirit will be the one who comes and brings his Torah to the coasts and islands, the furthest reach on the map. It starts here, this kingdom manifesto, with Jesus telling everyone what life in this kingdom is going to be like. Then, Moses, Messiah, manifests the kingdom through miracles. The next 2 chapters are going to show us about 10 story moments where Jesus is healing in all kinds of ways, whether it's restoring sight, giving people their strength back in their legs, casting out demons. And that in and of itself is a particular point that we need to be paying attention to. Why is it that so much demonic activity is happening inside the geographic boundaries of Israel? right? When you flip the pages back to the Old Testament, where do you see demonic activity ever happening anywhere between the cities of Dan in the north and Beersheba in the south? Now you can say, well, of course, Satan's pulling the strings behind these stories. How else do you get a David to fall to temptation? Sure, but we don't have stories like a man sitting in a synagogue on a Sabbath, just like anybody else that sits beside us on a church pew on Sunday, filled with demons, and nobody suspects it any other Sabbath until Jesus walks in and starts reading from Torah or some other part of the Old Testament, and then this guy can't hold himself back. Why is this happening? And again, why anywhere else when Jesus walks into a town, not only are people who are filled with all kinds of physical maladies brought to his feet, but people who are possessed with demons. What is said about demons in the Old Testament is that when God raises a city or a nation to the ground and it's overrun with wildlife and the growth of grass and weeds and whatnot, it often becomes the haunt of jackals, which some of those words translated as osprey or ostriches in the Old Testament are actually Hebrew words that reference demons. These judged places will become the places where demons inhabit. So essentially, God has allowed Israel and Jerusalem over the 5 centuries from restoration under Ezra to Jesus to continue to creep further toward this moment now where they are almost in some ways worse than they've ever been, if we understand the story correctly. So anyway, interspersed throughout all of this comes the continuation of the call to follow Jesus, the Moses Messiah who was out in the wilderness leading people on the campaign to flee the Egypt of Israel behind and walk into the glorious new kingdom that he's leading them into. And it will come at a cost. It will have hardships, just like the generation in the wilderness for 40 years. Total dependence upon God every day for everything. Jesus teaches these very things in these moments. All right. In Matthew, well, just went through that. So, in chapter 10, this is where we were when we got to our second discourse. We have a renewed Israel. This is where Jesus summons the remaining 12 to rebrand them as apostles, emissaries, to now go to the nations. But first, he sends them to go to the lost sheep of Israel. Now, the reason why this is important, because Jesus tells them, you will not go to all of the towns of Israel. And remember, they're not focusing on any of the Gentile territories, just the areas of the towns of Israel. You will not finish going through all of these towns before the Son of Man comes. And when I taught this several months ago, I raised the question, what can that mean? It requires some measure of mental gymnastics, I think, if we're going to try to transmit this into a future setting. It seems that Jesus is speaking of a yet another coming, because he's already there on the scene, and he's telling them this work will not be concluded before that moment comes. So we got a mental post-it note we're going to have to come back to at the end of our talk together when we actually get into Matthew 24. But nonetheless, the commission is to go and to start the conquest here in Israel before the conquest spills out past their natural borders into the far-flung areas where the Gentiles live. So we get to chapter 12, and now we go from Messiah Moses or Messiah Israel to Messiah David. He emerges as the Lord of the Sabbath and the bringer of a new temple. This is why we see David being the operative reference in the background here. Have you not read the story where David and his men went to go see the high priest at Nob? They hadn't eaten for many days, right? And all that good stuff. So that plus the talk about why this was happening on a Sabbath. And Jesus saying in the very immediate chapter before this that he is the one who brings rest. Come on unto me, all you who are burdened, heavy laden. I will give you rest, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Then he goes on into the next chapter to talk about what Sabbath really means. That man wasn't made for the Sabbath, man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath for man. Moving on, Messiah David's family at the end of this chapter are those who do the will of Yahweh. Understand this. This also frames up the conversation for chapter 24. God's family in the Old Testament is branded as Israel, right? And the way you become a part of that family is by virtue of the covenant marker that is given to them in Genesis 17. When Abraham's name is changed from Abram to Abraham, every male in his house, whether slave or freeborn, has to be circumcised 8 days after birth. If not, you're not a part of this covenant family. It doesn't matter what's in your blood. But Jesus is essentially saying in this very charged statement here That it doesn't matter if you share the bloodline of Abraham. It doesn't matter if you're my own genetic relation. What matters is if you do the will of my Father in heaven. Those people are my mother, my father, my brothers and sisters. So essentially, credentials to get you into the kingdom do not revolve around, nor are they built upon the foundation of, are you descended from Abraham? This is why Jesus tells them in the very scandalous way that he does. You will be shocked when you see those coming from the far west and the far east coming to sit down at the table alongside Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet the sons to whom the kingdom belongs are cast out, right? Because that street cred doesn't get you anything anymore. You have to essentially be reborn, and whether ethnically Jewish or Gentile, this rebirth is going to be what gets you into the kingdom by virtue of the fact a new heart guarantees, to a degree, obedience. Messiah David announces the kingdom work of Yahweh is now harvestable and possessable. The parable discourse in Matthew 13, all those parables about the parable of the sower all the way down to the parable of the dragnet, as we talked about it then, was essentially painting the picture of, for the last 5 centuries, in the shadows of the exiles that came at the hands of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Maybe you remember the word picture I gave then. It was like God was taking these people through the judgment brought by these kings, scooping them up out of the land of Israel, and blowing them to the nations because they get flung everywhere. And they become the seeds, essentially like the seed caster of the beginning of Matthew 13, throwing them out to the nations. And they become the fertile seedbed that the kingdom is going to spread like wildfire throughout the Roman world and outside the Roman world. And we know that because, well, when we look to the book of Acts, when the missionary movements actually start, where do these Jews go to first when they enter into a new town? The synagogue. And why? Because you've got a bunch of people here who know these scriptures, at least they should, like the back of their hand. They're all familiar with these stories. They hear them every Sabbath. They should be able to see the evidence, hear it presented, and by virtue of that come to the natural corollary, Jesus is Messiah. And then when that effort is quasi-successful, as some Jews believe, some will reject and cast them out, then they move on to the Gentiles. And churches can be born with Jewish leaders and Gentile leaders at the head, Jewish brothers and sisters educating their newfound Gentile brothers and sisters on these stories because that's the only Bible they have at the moment, and help them see the richness of what God is doing with this new covenant community, this new covenant family, and the rich heritage they've now walked into. Though they've been walking in darkness for centuries, now they get to participate in this heritage as part of Israel. Then Messiah Elisha condemns them as blind guides. Now we've moved from chapter 13 to chapter 15. And this is where Jesus really starts to turn the heat up on his condemnation toward the religious leaders in Jerusalem, because Jesus tells them, leave them alone. Don't worry about addressing these guys. They are essentially blind guides. Now you might ask, why is this Elisha? Well, if we looked at David and Jesus and their stories paralleled together, David represents a period of Israel under a united monarchy. We move past that in the story of David, and eventually on the other side of Solomon, the kingdom fractures. Matthew is showing us something very similar here. What I'm telling you is this, is if Matthew starts the story off with Jesus as a new Moses and a united Israel behind him, just waiting for the eruption of the kingdom, how does that story pan out? Well, in the Old Testament, it didn't really go so well, right? Even when they come out of Egypt, it starts off with obstacles almost immediately. And they go through centuries of judges and continuation of rebellion until they get their king, and that still doesn't bring in a period of them actually being obedient to God. The heyday of the kingdom under David and Solomon brought blessings, but yet still it ultimately wound up a tremendous failure with the kingdom being fractured, with David's grandson being the one who rules over his throne. So what am I telling you? In a very rapid fashion way, Matthew is telling the story of Jesus, showing us the same thing. The great excitement and anticipation at the beginning of the gospel is now starting to show a clear dichotomy between those who believe Jesus is Messiah and are willing to do whatever he asks. Fight Romans or walk on water, it doesn't matter. But there are plenty of other people who are willing to spit in this man's face and rip his beard out and condemn him as a heretic and crucify him. So, we see that in the story of Elisha in the Old Testament, And Elisha is a prophet in the northern kingdom who's trying to call rebellious Israelites back to the covenant agreement they have with their ancestral God, who want nothing more than to spit in his face and stomp on his name. That's what the Pharisees are doing. They are going to be the ones who, at the Sanhedrin trial of Jesus, will be doing that very thing. So, like Elisha, who led an army of men made blind by his spoken word and God's power over him to a Samaritan king, the northern kingdom of Israel, to show God's power, Jesus is kind of mimicking that same activity by pronouncing the Pharisees as blind guides. So now would be a good point to make sure I haven't dropped too many bodies off the back of this bus. Are we all tracking so far how this story is leading up? Are we all tracking? Jesus is a new Moses, but he's also kind of playing out each of those storied moments of Israel's past as we're moving from frame to frame. And I know we're going super fast, but now we'll just kind of let this sit for a moment, marinate. Do we have any questions so far? Anything that needs to be cleared up? Nothing? All right, because I'm moving from third gear to fourth here. All right, we're going. Matthew 16. Now it gets even more intense. Pharisees and Sadducees are outright condemned as false teachers. I'm not going to spend too much time there for the sake of what we have to move on to, because this will eventually get us up to chapter 21. I tried to cut out a few of these other chapters because I felt if I dug in the mud there, I'd just get lost in the sauce, and you along with me. So now we're at chapter 21. Now we've went from Messiah Elisha to Messiah Jehu. This is the chapter of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Now, if we followed the story pattern of the Old Testament, where do we see anything like the celebration of a king entering into the city other than what you have with David coming back after he was chased out by Absalom, or when you consider the business of what Jesus is about to do, there's another story very similar to that. So you have the frame of David in the backdrop, sure. But when you follow the trajectory of Matthew's story, walking through the Old Testament, we've left David behind. So what other king after him has anything like this kind of pomp going on when he comes in to the capital city of the kingdom? It's Jehu, the only one. And Jehu, like Jesus from Matthew 4, is an anointed king. Remember, Elijah was told he needs to anoint 3 people, and he only does 1. That's Elisha. Elisha picks up the mantle, and he anoints Jehu, who is going to destroy the dynasty of Omri, the wicked father of wickeder Ahab. And when he rides into Samaria, he kicks all kinds of tail and doesn't take any kind of names, because he raises everything to the ground. Oh, you're Ahab's second cousin, twice removed, best friend's dog? You're dead. I mean, everybody dies, right? Even a king of Judah dies in the process. So he understood his mandate very well and went a bit too far with it, but he actually was the one that brought about the execution of the prophecy that Jezebel's blood would be lapped up by dogs as her carcass was eaten. So if we understand that, and consider what Jesus is about to do, he is not just a David being welcomed by some, but the business he'll do in the temple there on the highest and most sacred point in Jerusalem is going to be like Jehu coming to the idolatrous temple of Baal in Samaria and razing it to the ground. Because the very next thing that happens here is that Jesus goes to the temple, he's kicking over tables, smashing animal crates and the dust and everything flying around as everybody's just looking there with awestruck on their face and wondering what just happened here and where does this guy get off thinking he can do this. He speaks the words of both Isaiah, pre-exilic prophet, Jeremiah, post-exilic prophet, really tying the shoestrings tight here for us to understand what's the thrust behind this. A house of prayer for all nations, but you made it a den of thieves. And this is a symbolic act, not just meant to cleanse the temple, but to pantomime its impending and inevitable destruction. Because this place has become, as Jeremiah said then, so Jesus echoes now, a den of thieves that is not fit for worship. Because if he's echoing the sentiments of Jeremiah, remember in Jeremiah's day, Ezekiel in Babylon, on the other side of the Euphrates, called in a vision by the Spirit, comes into this temple, and what does he see happening in the courtyard and in the secret spaces? There's shrines, tapestries to every god in Canaan you can imagine, and those beyond the Euphrates being worshipped alongside the altar of Yahweh. Now, there are no idol statues there that you can find on the Temple Mount while Jesus is standing there, at least not the inanimate ones. But there's a ton of idol statues all standing around him, and they're the ones who open their mouths and say, "Who do you think you are?" Because they put themselves in a position of primacy over Yahweh and proper worship of Him by them, His covenant people, and even the Gentiles whose very place in the temple they have defiled with their many wares. So now Messiah Jeremiah denounces the temple. It's ripe for destruction. And we get to chapter 24 finally, where Egypt / Samaria, or Jerusalem, will fall to the new Moses / Jehu, who is leading the Assyria-Babylon army, or Rome, to the charge of destroying this temple. Now, there's so many things that we have to go into here, and I'm only going to give you a taste of some of them because each of these individual points all probably deserve their own lesson, and I've got about 30 minutes to spit it out to you. So, granted, it's going a little quickly, I got it, but if there's an area where I would say we can downshift this puppy and park and talk a little bit, if we haven't done so already, this would be that place, because I imagine this is probably going to be one of those areas that start to really kick up the questions for you. We have to appreciate that at the very end of chapter 23 in verses 35 and 36, Jesus has, just as Jeremiah did, the religio-political leaders of his day, Jesus has done the same now to the leaders of his time when he looks to the Pharisees and he says, "Woe to you, Pharisees." Now, you might think that's kind of like a fifth grade teacher looking at her unruly pupils and saying, "Now, settle down, class, you're acting unruly." That's not it. When you look at a prophet in the Old Testament starting anything with woe, everything that comes out of his mouth after that is judgment brought by the divine hand of God that will be the end result of this pronouncement of woe. It's essentially a death sentence, and Jesus gives 5 of them in this chapter. You've got to understand that. If you're not appreciating that, then even though you might appreciate something more of the final culminating statements of, "And all the righteous blood spilt from Abel to Zechariah, whom you slay in front of the altar," which of course it wasn't them, it was their ancestors centuries ago, and yet Jesus puts this charge on their back. All that blood will be charged to you, and this destruction is going to come in this generation, which will not pass away until the summary execution of these woe statements, right? So, I'm going to enlarge this so that way we can appreciate it all together. If you're looking on the page in front of you, whether it's your iPhone screen, a tablet, or your Bible, I want you to follow along with me as we're reading this, which reminds me I need to do the same. All right. So, of course, when we start with verse 1, Jesus leaving the temple, he goes out. His disciples come and call his attention to the buildings, and he replied to them, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down." So while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, due east of Jerusalem, the disciples approached him privately and said, "Tell us then, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" If you're reading a translation that says world, it's more accurately translated age, because the Greek word, my first bullet point here, is aeon. It does not mean world. It means age. So, what age are we talking about? Well, before we try to define it here, let's see perhaps what another New Testament contributor actually thought about that. Flip in your Bibles quickly to 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, or just listen to me read it. Paul says, "These things happened to them as examples," referencing or invoking the stories of the Old Testament. "They were written for our instruction, on whom the ends of the ages, aeon, have come." So is Paul saying the end of the world has come upon them, and yet here we are 2,000 years later? Silly Paul. Clearly he doesn't understand. Maybe he does. Maybe we're not the ones who understand. So we must reference this passage then to help us better understand what Jesus perhaps could be talking about here. And it seems that what he may be referencing is the Old Covenant era, and how would we understand that to be perhaps what Matthew is hinting at? Because they've been under the provisions of the Old Covenant up until the moment when Jesus, with his disciples in the upper room, speaks to them and tells them this cup is his blood, the blood of the new covenant, which is given for them. What new covenant? That of Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36. The very covenant that is said will not be like the one given to our people at Sinai, but an altogether new covenant that will see with it a heart transformation. So, if we understand the clear teachings of the New Testament beyond this point, when Paul says Jesus is the first fruits from among the dead, why does he point that out? Because Jesus is the head of an altogether new humanity, a new humanity that comes from him, built upon him, connected to him the way that branches are to a vine, and draws its life from him. And if we understand the thrust of what Matthew has said up to this point, covenant relationship with God doesn't come because of one's circumcision of the flesh, but now of the heart. That's what matters. Following him obediently is what defines one as part of this Israel that is built upon the one who made this covenant with these people. So, we have to understand from the outset, Jesus here is not telling us in Matthew 24 that this is the sign of the end of the world. So that perhaps may immediately start to stall the engine for us and make us rethink, what have I been taught about this? Now from this point on, I want to be careful to try my best not to tell you what to think. Rather, to use everything we've talked about so far and allow you to continue to follow me through this, but ask questions along the way, and maybe we might arrive at some of the same conclusions. Maybe we won't. We'll see. All right, so next, Jesus goes on to say in verse 4, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, saying, I'm the Messiah. They will deceive many. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. But don't be alarmed, because these things must take place. But the end is not yet." This is something that will easily escape us if we're not students of history. Jesus was born under the reign of Augustus Caesar. One of the reasons why Augustus is so famous is not only because he's the adopted nephew turned son of the first true emperor of Rome, that being Julius Caesar, by whose name the entire dynasty was named after, right? Or because of the fact he beat Mark Antony in the Battle of Antioch or any of that other stuff. It's also because he was the one who started a near 200-year period of Roman history known as the Pax Romana. And here we are, just during the reign of Tiberius, Augustus' successor. We just started the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. That doesn't mean that there aren't wars and skirmishes that will occur during this period. But as far as Rome's history is concerned, this was its most peaceful period. For Jesus to be saying you will hear of wars and rumors and wars is scandalous for them. But what's on the horizon for them? The very Jewish-Roman war that's going to be coming within a generation. So they would easily be standing there somewhat awestruck. Pax Romana, it's the peace of Rome. What do you mean wars and rumors of wars? Jesus is warning them preemptively there is going to be an uneasy tension that's going to continue to swell and swell until it eventually arrives at the end of the Old Covenant age. And he's already told them what's going to be the clear marker of that end, the destruction of the temple. And there's no way the temple's destroyed and the city spared. Clearly, Jerusalem will go up in flames with it. He goes on to talk about famines and earthquakes. Most of us have our mind calibrated to what may happen in the future and that these must be signs that await us. But did these things happen in the time that interluded between Jesus speaking this and the destruction of Rome with the end of that generation? Because a biblical generation being 40 years, this is roughly early 30 AD, the Romans razed Jerusalem and the temple to the ground in AD 70. In that 40-year time period, can we look back at history and actually see these kinds of things happening? And I would say yes. Number one, you have Acts chapter 11. When you go to the end of that chapter, you have Agabus, a prophet, announcing to everyone a famine is about to hit the world. The world. Notice that. Now, when we hear that in Matthew 24, we might be thinking famines and earthquakes breaking across all continents, right? But when we consider the idea that world may mean aeon, as goes age, or world may mean something else. We'll get to that momentarily. It could mean the known inhabited world. The question then becomes, what geographic areas are really affected by these predicted famines and earthquakes that Jesus talked about? Agabus is saying a famine's going to fall upon the world, And it clearly doesn't consume all the world. It consumes the area of land that Rome rules. But as far as the biblical purview goes, that is the world. We'll get to that momentarily. That's a famine. What about earthquakes? Anybody ever heard of Pompeii? Right? And you can clearly go to Google now and search images from museum specimens of human beings that were clearly petrified in ash almost instantaneously. That volcanic eruption happened on the heels of an extremely violent earthquake. Let me just say, before I go any further with this, there are plenty of other extra-biblical resources that demonstrate for us there was more than just a single famine and more than just a single earthquake. In fact, between the years of Jesus' crucifixion and the downfall of Jerusalem in AD 70, earthquakes of various sizes were recorded to happen in Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Campania, Rome, and Judea. And of course, the worst of those perhaps being that of Pompeii itself. A first-century Roman historian who should be read right alongside Josephus for many reasons is Tacitus. This is what Tacitus says in his work known as the Annals of Imperial Rome. This year, which is known to be AD 50, witnessed many prodigies, signs, or omens, including repeated earthquakes, that as far as he, as a Roman pagan historian was concerned, are bad omens and signs sent that the gods must be angry with them. But he's clearly recording historical fact that all throughout everywhere where Roman senatorial or imperial provinces are known to be, there are earthquakes happening everywhere. Seems that Jesus' words are being fulfilled. Beyond Tacitus, we have a distinguished Roman statesman by the name of Seneca, and in his letters, and the title of the work is Letters from a Stoic, this is what he says. How often have cities in Asia, how often in Achaia, Achaia happens to be where Corinth is, been laid low by a single shock of an earthquake? Now, granted, these cities are not built with the same kind of construction materials we use, but can you imagine earthquakes so violent that entire cities are razed to the ground in the process by one tremor? How many towns in Syria, how many towns in Macedonia have been swallowed up? How often has this kind of destruction laid Cyprus in ruins? So apparently that island nation that Paul was raised in is constantly being affected by this. How often has Paphos collapsed? Not infrequently, but tidings brought to us of the utter destruction of entire cities, right? And then Josephus actually writes about a massive earthquake that hit right before Rome laid siege to Jerusalem. This is what he says. For by night there broke out a massive, dreadful tempest and violent, strong winds, with the most vehement showers and continual lightnings and horrid thunders and prodigious bellowings of the shaken earth, so that it was manifest, as he observes, that the constitution of the universe was confounded for the destruction of men, and anyone might easily conjecture that these things portended no common calamity. So apparently, Judea, amongst many of these places, is feeling it too. So, Jesus predicts famines and earthquakes. We have earthquakes covered. What about famines? So during the reign of Emperor Claudius, between the years of AD 41 through 54, this happens to be the actual famine that's being talked about by Agabus. This is what was said, this is what was said about the famine that came in year 51. Tacitus bemoans this. Not only earthquakes, but even dire famine-like circumstances are plaguing the entire Roman world. He says specifically, and I quote, "This year witnesses many prodigies, bad omens, and signs, including repeated earthquakes, and the shortage of corn resulting in famine. It was established that there was no more than 15 days' supply of food in the city of Rome," in Rome of all places, where you have to make sure you have enough food to feed everyone of noble birth, everyone who has enough coin to pay. If there is a high need anywhere, of course it's going to be Rome. In fact, that was part of the bargaining chip that Mark Antony was attempting to try to use as leverage against Augustus before Augustus ultimately defeated him in battle, because famine had struck Rome. He needed wheat from Egypt just to feed the inhabitants of the city, and Mark Antony was willing to give it to him at a very high price. In fact, he had to basically cede the entire southern half of the empire, or Rome's provinces. Anyway, only heaven's special favor and a mild winter prevented our catastrophe. In AD 68, Judah was grievously affected by famine. Now granted, at this point, Rome has laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, and all of Judea for that matter, and this is how bad the famine was noted by Josephus in the city of Jerusalem. Then did the famine widen its progress and devoured the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of women and children that were dying by famine, and the lanes of the city were full of the dead bodies of the aged. The children also and the young men wandered about the marketplaces like shadows. All swelled with the famine and fell down dead wheresoever their misery seized them. Clearly, as Jesus was prophesying these things would occur, the annals of history testify even outside of Scripture. They did. In the time period, He said they would come. Jesus goes on to say, they will kill you. You will be hated. We'll find this here in verse 9. Then they will hand you over to be persecuted. They will kill you. You will be hated by all the nations because of my name. Notice this. It's easy for us to read this as though Jesus is telling us these words, but Jesus is telling this to His 12 disciples who are with Him on the summit of the Mount of Olives, looking across the way westward to the temple that He just said is going to be destroyed. That they will hate them, they will kill them. In the preceding chapter, Jesus just lambasted the Pharisees with a woe statement saying, I will send you sages and prophets. Many of them you have killed, many of them you will crucify. So Jesus is predicting their persecution, not really ours. And does this come true? Well, let me ask you this. When was the last time you read the book of Acts? Come on now. Starting in chapter 4 through the rest of the book, that's what we're seeing. It starts with the Sanhedrin, and even outside of Judea and Israel proper, even in places like Rome and Corinth, there are persecution of Jewish messianic followers of Jesus at the hands of their own countrymen who denounce them as heretics. Then Jesus goes on to say that the gospel of the kingdom, in verse 14, this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So I got it. I might fancy the moment here where you could say, well, there it is. If it starts with Jerusalem and its destruction, this is clearly a moment when we start to pivot away from that, because Jesus is saying the gospel has to be preached to all the world. Well, if world is really aeon or age at the beginning of this chapter, world here is oikumene, as we already referenced, and it means the known world. So let's consider a few other examples of how this was used. So Bible drill time, if you're going to flip with me, you got to be quick about it, or just listen. So Luke chapter 2, verse 1, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole empire, but some translations say world, should be registered, but it's oikumene. So clearly it's only that part of the world that's under his jurisdiction, which as far as Bible writers are concerned in this time is Rome. It's the civilized world, right? Another example would be Acts chapter 11, verse 28, where Agabus prophesied this famine coming upon the whole world. But I would refer you to Romans chapter 1, verse 8. This is what Paul has to say. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because the news of your faith is being reported in the whole world. So clearly Paul means that if there are any Mesoamerican proto-civilizations here in the North American and South American continents, that the faith of the Romans who have followed Jesus as Messiah has reached their ears, right? Clearly, those peoples who were still scratching a living off of rocks wearing loincloths way before the ages of the samurai, or even the early dynasties of the Chinese, had already heard about the faith of the Roman Christians by this time. Right? Well, if we understand world to be every dotted space on the map where human beings could be living at this time, then that would be the case. But history clearly tells us that the gospel hasn't traveled that far yet. So what does Paul mean when he says your news of your faith has come to the whole world? Clearly, where Rome governs. What about Colossians 1:6? I'll give you this last example and then we'll move on. Paul says the same thing essentially. We'll back up to verse 5 just so this makes sense. Because of the hope reserved for you in heaven, you have already heard about this hope in the word of the truth, the gospel that has come to you. It is bearing fruit and growing all over the world, just as it has among you since the day you heard it and you came to truly appreciate God's grace. So again, we have to ask the question. So people that are living here in the Western Hemisphere are already hearing the gospel at this point when Paul was writing this letter to the churches in Colossae, right? Because if it's bearing fruit all over the world, clearly half the world cannot be left out of that. Or can it? It would if we understood oikumene means the inhabited world, and from a biblical purview, again, Roman Empire and a few areas to the far eastern and southern fringes. Does anybody have a question on that? Do we need to clear that up in any way, shape, or form?
I'm jumping ahead.
Go for it.
Just like all of those other chapters made us look back, is this scripture, could this be like then and in the future?
So a dual fulfillment. So essentially, if I understand the question correctly, if you're saying that there was a precedent in the Old Testament that defined how this story that Jesus has been walking through in the pages of Matthew is looking back to that, are we now turning a new page where Jesus is setting the precedent? The first example will be Jerusalem's destruction, but there might be a future fulfillment that will actually span the whole world. Is that what you're asking? That possibility exists. I certainly have to be humble enough to acquiesce to that. It totally could. However, the issue with that could very well be the precedent even for this story has already been set. Jerusalem has been destroyed before. And the reason why Jesus is now being a mimic of Jeremiah is because as Jeremiah was pronouncing, this temple will not provide you security. In chapter 7 and 26 of his scroll, he tells them, look to Shiloh, you remember, in the days of the Philistines under Samuel, God allowed this structure to be destroyed. It was the place of his habitation, and it granted no one safety. Even priests were killed that day. So, look back to that and know that the destruction of this city and temple will come again. So, if that's the case, it seems like the foreshadowing was there. It's happened already in the days of Jeremiah, and yet it will come again. And the issue with that is this. Remember, before they ever get carted off into exile, those pre-exile prophets are telling them, this is a very dark cloud coming, but there is a glint of a silver lining. God is not going to leave you in exile. You'll come back. And when you come back, Messiah is going to be at your head. He will be leading you into this new future. And you're going to have a new temple and a new city. And you'll never be uprooted from this land again. Remember? That's what Isaiah is saying. You'll be planted here like trees. And my people will never know trouble like this again. Okay. But then how does that play out on the stage of history? They come back under those initial waves with Zerubbabel and Ezra, and that's the promise they're all walking back with. We're going to go back to the land. Somehow God made it all work. He brought a Persian emperor to the head of all of these kingdoms and has now granted us our freedom, and we didn't have to lift a sword to win it back. So we're going home, and we have the son of David, Zerubbabel, with us, and maybe any day now he's going to become king, and we'll get our temple. Then the temple is built, but no king, and they're still waiting on that king, right? But eventually when that Messiah is declared and made known, here we go, game on. All those promises are fulfilled, and we'll never be uprooted from the land again. Then we get to the other side of AD 70, and they're violently ripped out of the land once again. For those that were not crucified to either trees, ramshackle crosses, or walls of houses and buildings in Jerusalem, were either carted off to Rome as part of the victory train led by Titus, son of Vespasian, and then sold into slavery or died along the way. So where does that promise then factor in? Either God is a liar because he said he would bring them back and never let them be uprooted, or what we're supposed to understand is that people who would be uprooted in the new Zion are a people that consists of both ethnic Jews and Gentiles who follow Messiah. And when we hear the words of Jesus telling this Samaritan woman at a well site in Samaria of all places, who's asking him about sacred sites, and he says, woman, the hour is coming, and it won't be too far away, when neither you will worship on that mountain or in Jerusalem. Why? Because temple presence will be everywhere. So a long and drawn out way of perhaps trying to answer that God is destroying the old and doing away with the old to make way for the new, and making good on those promises that his people will truly be planted in, quote, the land, but the land is now the world, and they will have their temple, but it's a temple built on him as foundation with living stones, i.e. us as the stones. If that's the case, which seems to be the clear teaching of everything that comes after this in the New Testament then, Is Jerusalem meant to be destroyed again? Is a temple meant to be built to then be destroyed again because an Antichrist unleashes hell on earth, making open season and open targets of ethnic Jews in Jerusalem who are worshiping in this temple? I don't know, because we haven't gotten to that point yet, so it could happen, but it seems like that might not be the way that the teaching of the New Testament seems to be pointing, if we understand these conclusions. But I don't want to say understand them rightly, because that's just me and the hubris that I would be having, saying this is the only way to see it. But that's what I seem to draw from it. Did that answer your question? I hope it did. Maybe? Kinda?
I'm really not sure.
Okay. So let me just sum up my answer in saying, I would say it's possible, but I don't think it's likely. And I think the reason why is because the AD destruction of Jerusalem is following on from the precedent of the 586 destruction of Jerusalem. That was the prefiguring of the last time this would happen. And with the new covenant, the promise by those Old Testament prophets would be this will never happen again. So if it happened then, are we looking for it to happen in the future? I think the chances are less than 50%. That's just me. Did that help any? Maybe? Made it a little clearer? I hope. So then he goes on to say this. I got to go back to Matthew 24 real quick. So in Matthew 24, Jesus will tell them in verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation. So I can hear you say, aha, gotcha, because there's got to be a new temple for there to be some statue of an Antichrist that's planted in the holy place, because that's what happened when Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, did this about 150 years before Jesus was born. Correct? Yeah, we've all heard that. But here's the thing. When you go to Luke 21:20, Luke does something very clear for us. Luke interprets the abomination of desolation for us. He says, when you see the armies surrounding the city. So if that's the case, because Jesus will go on to say, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. A man on his housetop must not come down to get his coat or his clothes or any of that stuff. Get out of the city now. Well, here's the thing. Jesus is speaking to people who in that day and time lived in these circumstances. Luke will go on to say, hope that this doesn't happen to you in the wintertime because traveling's a lot slower. Hopefully you are not a pregnant woman or a nursing mother, because clearly you got to stop to take scheduled breaks. But you have to leave with such haste. It's like being in Egypt, cloak tucked in, staff in hand, swallowing food now to taste it later because we're about to leave this place. He's telling them, when you see the armies, get out of Dodge. Don't dally, because if you do, when the ring closes around the city, if you come out, you're going to die. So how would that transmit to our current time, though? Number one, people in Jerusalem do not have houses built like they were in 1st century AD, where a fair portion of their daily routine would be up on the roof. And if they're on the precipice of their roof doing whatever it is that they did during that portion of the day, they can see over the walls and parapets to the armies coming across the horizon in the north down toward them. Why would this matter for a woman who is pregnant now if she has to flee from Jerusalem? You can get in your car, and within minutes, you're out of the city. Mere minutes. Why would it matter if a woman happens to be breastfeeding now? She can do that in the car on the way. It seems that Jesus is speaking this with a sense of urgency to people who are going to have a much slower form of travel than it would be in our own current modern time. And again, the housing construct doesn't even match this anymore, but it seems like one of the nails here that really put the coffin lid on this concept is the fact that Luke, reading behind Matthew and Mark, clearly wants his Gentile audience to understand this enigmatic, mysterious, highly Jewish significant sign of the abomination of desolation seems to be understood as the armies of Rome, right? Then he goes on to talk about fleeing to the mountains. Josephus tells us this is exactly what Christians living in Jerusalem did when the Romans came knocking on their door. When Vespasian broke the northern horizon and they saw the armies coming to them, those who remembered the words of Christ immediately fled and went to the city of Pella and waited out the destruction of Jerusalem that happened over the next 3.5 years. few of them were left or found in the city dead because they heeded the words of Christ. Then Jesus goes on to say this, verse 28, wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. Funny thing though, when you actually translate that word back into Greek, atos, vulture in most cases, contextually, both in Old and New Testament, because you have to look to the Greek translation of the Old to see its use there as well, happens to be eagle. Anybody in here watched a modern day Roman drama? Seen a Roman army marching on screen? Watched the battle standard being carried by the person at the head of the army? What happens to be at the top of that battle standard? What's the symbol? It's an eagle. It's an eagle. The symbol of the legion. So when the armies come and destroy the city and the temple, what standards do you think they're going to erect? It was always common practice. When a legion earned victory, they plant their standard. Why? Because this was declaring who the victor was and to whom the spoils will go. So Roman legionary standards would be implanted all over the city. The eagles would indeed fly where the carcasses were. So then we go further than this. Jesus says in verse 29, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not shed its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. The peoples of the earth will mourn. We could go on. This might be another place where we decide, let's switch the frame of reference here, because this certainly seems like stuff that comes to us out of the book of Revelation, right? This is definitely end of world, apocalyptic, judgmental stuff. Except for the fact this kind of language is used in other places in Scripture. We go to Isaiah 13. I would encourage you to turn there with me really quickly. Isaiah chapter 13, and this is what the prophet has to say about the destruction of the city of Babylon, and of course stood as the head of the entire nation. Trying to find my place there quickly. Verse 11 of chapter 13, I will punish the world, verse 10. Indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened when it rises, and the moon will not shine. What's he talking about? We go back to verse 1, a pronouncement concerning Babylon that Isaiah the son of Amos saw, the destruction of Babylon. So when Babylon was actually destroyed at the hands of the Persians, who just dammed up the Euphrates, crawled under the walls, put Belshazzar to death that night, and didn't have to kill anybody else to claim the city, did the sun rise the next day? Yeah, it's been arising for the last 3,000 years since the moment this happened. Did the stars continue to shine? They still do today. Has the moon given its light? Absolutely. So what in the world was Isaiah meaning when he said, when Babylon falls, this is what will happen? He's predicting the actual historical fall of the city. This is poetic, hyperbolic language. Jesus is echoing this when he says, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. What does he mean by that? The very same thing that Haggai is talking about when he says, once more, and I will shake the powers of heaven. When that temple, the final one, is glorified, again, the temple that we are per the teaching of the New Testament. So what is being signified here by Jesus echoing the words of Isaiah is essentially the Babylon of his day, which is Jerusalem, is going to befall the same destruction that Babylon of Isaiah's day did. And it will be so tormenting that just like the Babylonians who went to bed that night with Belshazzar, a Babylonian, on the throne and woke up the next day to Persians walking their streets, it was as if the sun didn't shine, at least not the same way, because while they're Babylonians, they're Persian subjects now. The stars, the heavenly luminaries that are governed by their gods, are now no longer under their control, but under the control of Persian gods. Their fates aren't their own. That's what Jesus is saying. So, wrapping this up, when he says, literally, all the peoples of the earth will mourn, if we translate that back into Greek, all the tribes of the land. Jesus is right outside Jerusalem, the land of Israel. From the patriarch Jacob, he has 12 sons, and these become the heads of 12 what? 12 tribes. Tribes of Israel that live in the land, because the land, the Aretz, is their inheritance. What was Jesus potentially saying when he said, the Son of Man is going to come, he's going to be leading the charge with the armies of Rome, and he is going to be destroying Jerusalem by virtue of the judgment that they've reaped upon their own heads? The tribes of the land, i.e. Israel, will mourn when they see the signs of his coming. Now, let me read to you a few things that Josephus has also recorded, and then I'm going to stop so we can maybe have a few questions being asked. Josephus gives us 7 particular signs that were noted to have happened right around the years of Rome's siege of Jerusalem from AD 66 to 70. First of all, in AD 66, it was noted there was a sword in the sky that lingered over the city for several days. So it was when a star resembling a sword stood over the city of Jerusalem, and a comet which continued for a year, lingered over the city when Rome was starting to stage her fight against them. Remember, Jesus says in verse 30 of Matthew 24, "Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven." He doesn't tell us exactly what that is, but I would think with respect to the iconography that we all appreciate as Christians, the one thing that seems to be most associated with Jesus as a sign is what? A cross. Take a sword, turn it upside down. What do you have? A cross. Seemingly the sign of both sword and cross lingering over the city for the better part of a year. As Jesus said, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. The very thing that Yahweh did in the Old Testament when he brought destruction against cities. There was also a very bright light that shone around the altar. So again, I'm reading from Josephus, before the revolt and the commotion that led to war, at the time when the people were assembling for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, on the 8th of the month of Nisan, at the 9th hour of the night, which is 3 a.m., so brilliant a light shone around the holy altar in the sanctuary of the temple that it seemed to be broad daylight, and this continued for about half an hour. By the inexperienced, this was regarded as a good omen, but by the sacred scribes, it was at once interpreted in accordance with later events, which of course was the destruction of the city. How about this? A cow giving birth to a lamb. This is what was said. At the same feast, just after the second sign, the bright light, the great light over the altar, a cow that had been brought by someone for sacrifice gave birth just before it was killed to a lamb in the midst of the court of the temple. And you want to talk about omens? That's spooky. Don't ask me what that means. I have no idea. But if this has literally happened in history, and those people of the day interpreted it as an omen per se, it clearly could not have been something good, more so ominous. Or this, the eastern gate opening by itself. The eastern gate of the inner court, it was of brass and very massive, and when closed towards evening, could scarcely be moved by 20 men, fastened with iron-bound bars on each side. It had bolts that were sunk to a great depth into a threshold consisting of solid blocks of stone. This gate was observed at the 6th hour of the night, or midnight, to have opened on its own accord. The watchman of the temple ran and reported the matter to the captain, and he came up and with great difficulty succeeded in shutting it. This again, to the uninitiated, seemed to be the best of omens, as they supposed that God had opened to them the gate of blessings. But the learned understood that the security of the temple was dissolving on its own accord, and that the opening of the gate meant a present to the enemy, interpreting the portent or sign in their own minds as indicative of coming desolation. In other words, it seemed that God was opening the gates for the enemies to come on in, just like he shut the ark by himself when Noah and his family entered in. What about this? Armies in the sky. Again, not many days after the festival on the 21st of Artemisium, or the Jewish month of Iyar, which is in the springtime, there appeared a miraculous phenomenon passing belief. Indeed, what I'm about to relate would, I imagine, have been deemed a fable were it not for the narratives of eyewitnesses and for the subsequent calamities which deserve to be so signalized. For before sunset, throughout all parts of the country of Judea, chariots were seen in the air and armed battalions hurtling through the clouds and encompassing the city. Why? Or what about voices speaking? Moreover, at the feast which is called Pentecost, the priests, all 24 of them, on entering the inner court of the temple by night, as was their custom, was in the discharge of their administrations, reported that they were conscious first of a commotion and a din or a great noise, and after that a voice as of a host or army. We are departing hence from here, is what the voices were said by many eyewitnesses to have stated. And then I find this perhaps to be one of the spookiest. The last prophet that came to them, whose name was Joshua, which Jesus' name in Hebrew happens to also be Joshua. So this is rather lengthy. I'm going to try to spit it out fast. But a further portent was even more alarming. 4 years before the war, AD 62, when the city was enjoying profound peace and prosperity, there came to the feast at which it was the custom of all Jews to erect tabernacles to God, one named Joshua, son of Ananias, a rude peasant, who standing in the temple suddenly began to cry out, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, and a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against all the people." Day and night he went about all the alleys with this cry in his lips. Some of the leading citizens, incensed at all these ill-omened words, arrested the fellow and severely chastised him. But he, without a word on his own behalf or of the private the private ear of those who smote him, only continued to hear his cries as before. Thereupon the magistrates, supposing, as was indeed the case, that the man was under some supernatural impulse, brought him before the Roman governor. There, although flayed to the bone with scourges, he neither sued for mercy nor shed a tear, but merely introducing the most mournful of variations into his words from his mouth, responded to each stroke with woe to Jerusalem. When Albinus, the Roman governor, asked him who he was and whence or where he came from, and why he uttered these cries, he answered him never a word, but unceasingly reiterated this dirge over the city, until Albinus pronounced him a maniac and let him go. So during the whole period up to the outbreak of the war in AD 66, he neither approached nor was even seen talking to any of the citizens, but daily, like a prayer, repeated this lament, "Woe to Jerusalem." He neither cursed any of those who beat him from day to day, nor blessed any of those who offered him food. To all men, that melancholy presage was the one reply. His cries were loudest at the festivals. So for 7 years and 5 months he continued with this wail, his voice never flagging nor his strength exhausted, until the siege. Having seen his presage verified, he found his rest. For while going his round and shouting in piercing tones from the wall, "Woe once more to the city and to the people and to the temple," as he added a last word, "And woe to me also," as a stone was hurled from the ballista and struck him, killing him on the spot. So with those ominous words still on his lips, he passed away. In the book of Revelation, John speaks of two witnesses. Two witnesses. Here, in a period of 7 years and 5 months, this man says nothing more on his mouth to everyone, whether innocent passerby or someone trying to fillet the meat off his bones. The one judgment coming. And his name too was Jesus. Woe to Jerusalem. So, given the thrust of everything Matthew has said up to this point, it would seem that the words that Jesus speaks here seems to have one historical point in mind. Now, of course, I would love to get into the contents of Matthew 25, but we can't get into that tonight. If anything, I'm trying to set you up for that conversation and some research to do on your own. And thankfully, we've got a little more than a week before we all convene to talk about this particular very important chapter and to chew on it some more when we see it spill over into Matthew 25. So, with that in mind, I know it's right at the moment we're supposed to be done with this, but are there any final concluding questions or thoughts before we part ways tonight?
So, do you think the 12 tribes of Israel are upset because they see the destruction of Babylon?
If by Babylon we're talking about Jerusalem in that day,
Right.
absolutely. Absolutely. And they will not let that city go lightly.
But you think the reference to Babylon is Jerusalem?
So both in the gospel or the epistles that are written by Jesus' apostles and the book of Revelation, my answer to you would be yes. Babylon is not referring to some present-day city or world government system, but from a strictly preterist point of view, this is pointing back to Jerusalem as the Babylon of its day. Now, granted, Rome shares in this. I could spend another hour talking to you about how Rome is caught up in this conflagration as well. The very companion of Josephus, the Roman historian Tacitus, tells us that the world around him was literally falling apart when Nero committed suicide and left the kingdom without a rightful heir, the last in Caesar's line. That gave rise to the Flavian dynasty under Vespasian, who then went to rule because he was the only one who curried enough favor throughout Rome to be able to quell the rebellion. That 1 year before Vespasian left is known still to this day as the year of 4 emperors. In a period of 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, and almost another few months, 4 men ruled on that throne. And the empire itself was being literally torn apart into factions and on the very brink of civil war. And Tacitus' own words was that the world would end if Rome did not find a way forward. So Rome was experiencing judgment too, because under Nero, he was literally burning Christians as candlelights for his garden parties, right? So just as Jerusalem was drunk with the blood of the saints, riding on the back of this horrible iron-clawed, iron-teethed beast that was doing the same, both would fall under judgment. But then, I would argue not now. But that's just me. Anybody else? Well, if not, thank you for your time. Let's end in a quick prayer. Thank you, Jesus, for this moment. Lord, only you can make these words clear and understandable to us, and I pray that you would. We all have a tendency to be compelled in some way to take a stance, to try to figure these things out. We are often mesmerized by the concepts of eschatology and what the future may hold. But Lord, help us to not be bogged down with preconceived concepts that others are trying to tell us should frame our way of understanding. By your Spirit, would you lead us to all truth? And I ask this for myself tenfold over before I do my own brothers and sisters, Lord. As I try to faithfully teach this, if I'm wrong, Lord, show me and lead me unto the truth as you try to lead us all. Help us to hear and follow. We ask it in your name. Amen.